So I thought when you start a novel, you want to start with something with a bang. So I have one question I really want to ask Joyce, so I'm starting with that one. This is a quote from her memoir, The Lost Landscape. Quotes, "Sometimes in my writing, when I am most absorbed and fascinated to the point of anxiety, I find myself imagining that what I am inventing is in some way real. If I can solve the mystery of the fiction, I will solve the mystery of my life. So my question, Joyce, is how close are you to tracking down either the mystery of fiction or your life?"
Well, that's a very good question, and I think that all art is governed and galvanized by unconscious processes which we don't understand. We can see in the work, for instance, of Van Gogh, that the paintings and the canvases are just extraordinarily rich and almost like churning with emotion and mystery. And when we look at a canvas of someone like Van Gogh, then we look at a canvas of someone who's in the same landscape, literally the same landscape, it might be very, very different. So we can understand that these processes are extremely beyond rational comprehension. So for me to answer questions like that, I try to be as honest as I can. I'm governed, like everybody, by moods and compulsions and obsessions that I don't quite understand. So I would like to be able to understand a little more. So when I start writing a novel, I usually have assembled some characters together. There are people who seem very real to me. So my reading of reality is that when people meet, that there is then set into being a kind of narrative. You have met a person with whom you might fall in love, and then time passes and a family ensues and so forth. So that the meeting of two people who had not met before starts into being a narrative. So I think that novels are like that they replicate the real world. You set a number of people together, something happens to them which stimulates and galvanizes them, crystallizes a story, and the story really emerges out of those people. So how does that relate to one's own life? Well, I think that when we're very young, we are looking around for causal relationships and like why something has happened, what these people mean, our elders, our family. And I did grow up in a wonderful family, actually, but it was sort of surrounded by mysteries and things that people didn't talk about, which I found that when I was much older, these were secrets of the family that were sort of shameful or embarrassing or awful. And so I think that principle of looking for reasons for things that are mysterious is a principle of being a writer. And if you looked into, since you're a writer also, if you looked into your own background, you might see something similar, where you were once a really small child trying to figure things out among the adult world.
Do you know, so I am a writer. One of the reasons I so enjoy writing fiction is to escape from this world we're in. I'm looking at what's happening in politics, I'm looking at what's happening overseas, and you know, I love my family, I love my friends, but sometimes I'd rather spend my time in my world of fiction than in this world. How about you?
Well, you can control that world. You can give it a happy ending or a resolution that's pointing toward a happy ending, which obviously we can't do in the real world. Well, no, I think that's one of the reasons that people write. Didn't Freud say that art hallucinates ego mastery? It's a rather cynical remark, but that was Freud. Art hallucinates ego mastery, so you're giving yourself a kind of hallucination, controlling something, whereas the larger world is beyond your control.
E.L. Doctorow once said that writing fiction is a socially acceptable form of schizophrenia.
I used to know Ed Doctorow. Mm-hmm. But Ed Doctorow, as you know, is extremely concerned with social justice and social injustice in American history and the mythologizing of American history. Ed was really interested in clarifying things and bringing things to bear, into light. So I think he was being a little funny when he said it's schizophrenic, because schizophrenia suggests a helplessness where the brain is actually sort of deteriorated, whereas art always suggests control and formations and use of structure is a kind of coherence and beauty and clarity to art that we don't find in mental illness.
Well, sometimes in terms of coherence and control, doesn't what you're writing just come to you from you don't know where?
Well, we know where it comes from. It comes from the human brain. So it comes from maybe the unconscious part of your own brain, the same place that dreams come from. Yes, I give assignments to my students, and I say that just start writing. I give them a certain assignment, even though they don't maybe think they can do it. After some minutes, they will start to be writing. For instance, the assignment is to write a monologue in the voice of someone not yourself, different sex, different age, different skin color, culture. And most students think they can't do that. But then, since I tell them they have to do it,
and you're the professor.
It really is very helpful if somebody says, you have to do that. I say, well, okay, I'll do it then. But if it's optional, then maybe they wouldn't do it. But where does that come from, that imagination? It comes from the human capacity for imagining out of the unconscious, the same place that our rich dreams come from. I mean, you could never invent your dreams. You couldn't sit and invent a dream, but they just come in this so extraordinary and surreal, this whole Chagall landscape that comes out of the imagination.
So you mentioned that Ed Doctorow has social issues in mind. So, of course, if you're a writer, what you really want to do is entertain your reader and make sure that he or she keeps turning the pages. What more do you want a reader to take away besides entertainment from what you've written?
Well, you mentioned Ed Doctorow. He would call himself an old lefty. He's very much far left, very concerned with politics. Most of his writing is suffused with a political awareness. One of his first novels is a Book of Daniel, which is about the Rosenbergs. You've probably read that. Yeah, I used to teach that. That was a very, very wonderful novel, and just suffused with the politics of the time. So that's one way that literature can go. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is a way of bringing into consciousness many things that were not exactly understood, particularly to people in the North who didn't understand what slavery was, or even people in the South who didn't have slaves. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a way to embody much that was not stated and given a form until then. So that's also about enormous social injustice and had a galvanizing effect on American history, that one novel. And Upton Sinclair writing The Jungle, again, he was writing about terrible conditions in the slaughterhouses in Chicago in about 1906. And so that novel, The Jungle, also had an immediate effect. Teddy Roosevelt called Upton Sinclair to Washington to actually talk to him about things in the novel. So that's one way that literature can go, which is sort of the public way. Dickens is another person who's very concerned with the social justice. But then there's another kind of writing, exemplified by Emily Dickinson, for instance, which is very inward and very much psychological and dealing with spiritual subtleties and the complexities of life. Emily Dickinson is our great poet of loss. She writes about loving people and losing people, tending to people who are ill and having to bid goodbye to these people. But you would not know that Emily Dickinson was writing during the Civil War. She doesn't have that political expansiveness that you find in Walt Whitman and other people. I think as a writer, when I write a novel, I almost always have a broad social canvas. It's a socially dense, culturally aware, and politically dramatized novel that I want to write. I almost never write something that's only inward. But I might write a short story that was just about somebody who falls in love or somebody who falls out of love. I might write poetry from a certain perspective that's very small and contained. But to me, the larger genre, I think should address society in a way.
So let's talk about the inward side, and let's get particular. Your latest novel is The Man Without a Shadow, and you seem to be saying something about memory. In fact, in a lot of your novels, you seem to be saying something about memory. But let's talk about The Man Without a Shadow. What are you telling us about memory in that book?
Well, a novel has many things, and a novel sort of dramatizes many things, so I'm not sure that I could just condense what I was trying to say. It's so complicated. I was writing about a woman scientist. I wanted to immerse myself in what I could of neuroscience. My husband, Charles Gross, is a neuroscientist, and he's been teaching at Princeton for a long time.
I'm listening carefully. I have a daughter who's majoring in neuroscience in college,
wow.
so I'm listening carefully.
Neuroscience is a cutting-edge science, and people think that they can read about it, and a lot of brain books about the brain in bookstores that are popularized versions. But it's very difficult. All science today is extremely specialized and very, very difficult. It's basically impenetrable to the layman. But I wanted to find out as much as I could about it. My husband has all these books on his shelf. He has a collection of all Darwin's writings and many, many contemporary works on memory. So I was reading books on memory to the extent that I could read them. And then Suzanne Corcoran's book, which is called Permanent Present Tense, The Amazing Life of the Amnesiac H.M., that is the book that I use particularly to research. And 2 or 3 other people working in memory, I read their work. So when you're doing research for a novel, I think, and maybe some people in the room are researching novels or have an interest in historical novels, the best thing to do is just sort of read and take a few notes, but not try to have exhaustive notes. I think you get burdened and paralyzed by knowing too much. You want to know a few general things, and then literally when you're taking notes, leave space on your paper, because you might want to write some things in. I did a lot of research on the life of Norma Jean Baker, who became Marilyn Monroe. This is about
The blonde, of course.
1999. And that was another situation where I didn't want too much detail because that would weight it down. But I saw all of Marilyn Monroe's movies that were available. I saw them in chronological order.
Which is your favorite?
Pardon me?
Which is your favorite of her movies?
Oh, well, I guess Niagara, maybe.
Pardon me?
Niagara. That was the one where
Right.
She
With
went from
Joseph
being...
Cotton, right?
Yes. She went from being a starlet and something of an ingenue to being the enormous mega symbol that she is, in our memories today. But before that, she wasn't. She was a starlet. She was a good actress. But it was with Niagara that the billboards all around the country featured her, and she was made into this iconic figure, not necessarily for her own good. I mean, that's the sort of thing where you can't go back. She couldn't.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yes. So, but Niagara is actually quite wonderful, and it's almost like German expressionism. Then I like Some Like It Hot.
Which I have to say, embarrassedly maybe, it's my favorite.
It's so wonderful. It's wonderful. But when I researched Some Like It Hot, I was astonished, as anybody would be, to learn that during that period, when Marilyn Monroe is so wonderful, she's so funny, people just fall in love with her. The whole movie is wonderful. That was a time in her life when she was so deeply miserable. She was so unhappy. People on the set hated her. She was impossible.
Because she was always late.
She was always late, but she couldn't help it. She was deeply neurotic. She was addicted to barbiturates. And when I wrote my novel, I was sort of trying to write about that, how we don't know what's inside people. When you see that movie, you think, oh, she's just so effervescent, or she's delightful. That wasn't the way she was. She was acting. She was an actress. She was a professional actress, and she could do the thing that actors do. They put their personal lives away. They step out with the lights and the cameras, and she performed. That's something that you wouldn't necessarily know if you just watched the movies.
But does that happen to you as a writer? People say, oh, you said such and such, and you go, oh no, that wasn't me. That was the character in the...
That's a character in the novel. Well, I think there's something to that. When I'm writing, when I'm carried away and very intensely writing, I do put aside my worries. I have as many worries as anybody, I suppose. Things that will never be solved, things that's like a big cloud over the head that's not going to go away. But somehow when I'm teaching, when I'm writing, I just forget about it. So that's something that I can recommend. It's the kind of transcendental experience of being a writer or any kind of artist. Probably when people play piano, if they can, or any musical instrument, if you really play well, you could lose yourself in that beautiful music. I don't have that ability, so if I'm playing piano, I'm actually sort of listening to what it is, you know. Whereas somebody who could really play, it would be like the music course through the hands and into the world, and it would be a way of transcending your own particular personality.
Well, someone has said to me, "Oh, I was reading your novel, and you're the protagonist." And I've said, you have it exactly backwards. It's not that I'm the protagonist, it's that it's that I become the protagonist. I try to put myself inside that person's head.
Yes. Well, it's an analog also with brilliant stand-up comedy. We have a number of, in our history, particularly in Jewish history, these fantastic stand-up comics. And those people are brilliant, they're geniuses of kind, but that's not the person. You know, that's the persona who stands there and is very funny and witty, and like Sid Caesar, for instance, was so wonderful, and Jack Benny, and Steve Martin, though he's not Jewish, but Steve Martin.
Yeah, what's wrong with him?
I don't know. It was an oversight. He would say he would probably say he was just as neurotic. But just Woody Allen's a good example. People who stand up there, they create the comic persona that is so funny and quick and witty, but that's actually not the person. The person is someone who's over here, and so too with the writer. The writer is not the protagonist. The writer has created the protagonist.
So, do you keep a catalog of ideas, or do they just come to you when you type the end of whatever work you're working on? How long of a break do you take between projects, and how do you decide what's next?
Well, I'm really flooded with ideas, and I love to run. When I run or walk fast, lots of ideas come to me. So when I'm working on a novel, as I said, I'm putting together a group of people whom I care for. I may even love some of these people. They may be based a little bit on people I have known who may not be alive anymore. You know, as you get older, you lose people. The older generation dies, and they're irreplaceable. And then your own generation starts to pass away, and it's just very painful. But you can go back to these people, particularly in a memoir or in a novel. You can give them life again to some degree. People who are funny, who are witty, who are warm and generous, you can take things that they've done or remarks they made and put them in your novel. So it's like they have this other extra life. So I think of the people who are going through an experience together over a period of months. So the new novel I'm working on, the father dies fairly unexpectedly. The family of 5 children and the wife are completely derailed. How do they get back on course? Well, some of them don't exactly get back on their old course, but they're in some new track. The wife has been so loved by the husband, they've had a beautiful marriage. And it's almost that having had a beautiful marriage makes her incapacitated for going on alone. If it had been a bad marriage, it would be a different story. And so I'm sort of writing about a very, very strong marriage where the husband dies. The wife has to continue. How does she do that? That's plausible and reasonable, but yet maybe some surprises, because we all get surprised. So in my novel, I get very excited writing it, I have some things lined up for her that are very plausible, and maybe I've even experienced them myself, but then there'll be some surprises that will come to her. So I know that very ending of the novel, I know exactly how it ends, and I just have to get her to that point, because I know that's where she's headed. So I find this very thrilling, and as I work on it, I get new ideas, and if I go running, or if I see a movie, like the other day I saw The World of Apu, the wonderful Indian film. There's a trilogy, and probably many of you have seen it. And that was very beautiful. And though it's not going to influence my novel, but yet it's an example of, in a movie, which we don't often have, seeing a young man meet a young woman. You see them meet, and they actually fall in love over the course of the movie, then he loses her. And you see his grief, which is so wrong. And the movie just tears your heart, because our American movies don't often seem to do that. Love is sort of satirized or something. But this movie is like opening a little window and seeing people in their real lives and seeing, well, this is what love is, and he did really love her, and she loved him, and then they lose that. But then he's suicidal, but then he doesn't commit suicide, but he finds a way. And I guess I'm just interested in how people who truly are devastated by loss, they pick themselves up, they find a way to keep going. And often what they do is helping other people. They find a way of helping themselves, they help other people, but they didn't know that they would do that when they had the happy marriage. So that's sort of a theme in my writing.
So one of the things you just said is that in writing, as we grow older, people die, and you can help, and you can almost bring back aspects of them through your writing. So I'm going to talk about one particular instance about your grandmother, Rebecca Morgenstern. So I have to say one of the things that Joyce and I talked about before coming up here is that she had a grandmother, Rebecca Morgenstern, who was Jewish, and I had a grandmother, Libby Morgenstern, who was Jewish. Maybe we're cousins. Anyway.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Anyway. Oh, I'd be honored. Anyway, were you feeling some sort of void in your knowledge of your grandmother in writing your book, The Gravedigger's Daughter? Were you giving her a past you didn't know about? How did that work with your memory?
Well, the melancholy thing, or the tragic thing about my wonderful grandmother, so I hope I don't start to cry. She was such a wonderful person. She was so totally loving. And yet, after she died, it came to light that she was Jewish. We didn't know she was Jewish. And she had a life that was completely secret. And we didn't really understand that. And so I wrote this novel. It must have been, her people came from...
No, I'm sorry. I just want to... No. I just want to say it isn't a novel. It's a tour de force.
Oh, so the gravedigger's daughter was my grandmother. She was a gravedigger's daughter, and they came from somewhere in Germany in the 1890s. And instead of settling in New York City or Boston, where there would be a Jewish community, they continued to settle. They went to upstate New York, which is such a bizarre place to go to. Like that's where I'm from, of course. Like you wonder, like, why would anybody go up there? It's north of Buffalo. That's called the Snow Belt. So there are no Jews there, no synagogue, just this sort of wild, remote, terribly cold and snowy part of the world. Like, first of all, why would anyone go there? And that's strange. And then my grandmother lived a life where she was completely devoted to her family. She didn't seem to have her own life. And she never complained, or she never had any negative emotions about anything. She was always so positive. She loved her grandchildren. And I know it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but actually I'm not. So she brought me my first typewriter. She brought me, every birthday and Christmas was a book, because of the whole revering of books, which is, of course, very Jewish. But we didn't know she was Jewish. So after she died, my biographer was doing investigative reportage and looking around at records, and he discovered that she was Jewish. And, of course, her name was Morgenstern. I guess that's a Jewish name, but we just thought it was a German name. You know, it is a German name. It was a German word.
Morning Star, of course. Marjorie Morningstar.
Yeah. So I wrote the novel because I wanted to revisit her. I had been too young and self-centered. You know, when you're a child, you still don't think about anything except yourself. Like, it would never occur to me that my grandmother was a person. You know, she was like my grandmother. And she got me presents. And children, that's the way children are. You know, and then when they get to be older, they suddenly, they realize, well, this was actually a person who had a whole life. And it's really so overwhelming. And my grandmother did not have an easy life, and so I wrote about what I knew about her life. She herself married a man named Oates, and of course my name is Oates. She married a man named Oates who was a very handsome Irishman, and he had a penchant for drinking, and he eventually left her with a little baby, which is my father. So they say the Irish will break your heart. So there's a sort of theme in my writing of the father or grandfather who disappears, the person who is very charming and charismatic, but he has some fatal flaw, he drinks, he abuses his wife, and then he just disappears. So the gravedigger's daughter deals with that. She meets, falls in love with a charismatic man, she has a baby, he's abusive, and then he disappears. And so it does replicate. And then I have an ending that's very, to me, very touching. So there are many things about my own life that are in the novel, but the whole novel basically is fiction. It has an emotional resonance.
Can we talk about teaching for a second?
Yes.
So in your memoir, you wrote, Professor Donald Dyke urged you not to go to grad school and just write.
Yes.
Was his advice sound? Now, Joshua Siegel, the protagonist of The Tattooed Girl, I said that there was a book here with girl in the title. The Tattooed Girl, quote, Joshua Siegel had never accepted a permanent teaching position at a university because he'd felt early on the powerful attraction of teaching is an emotional substitute for writing. And yet you do teach. So how does teaching affect your writing?
That novel, The Tattooed Girl, well, it's not about Philip Roth at all, but it's dedicated to Philip Roth, and it's about some themes that Philip pursues. And Philip, as you know, maybe you don't know him, but he is a friend of mine. Philip always thought that to be a writer really meant almost like a monastic calling, where he has spent a lot of his time alone in northwestern Connecticut, where he has a country place. Now he's stopped writing, actually.
I'm going to ask you about that in a second, but so go ahead.
He felt that it just sort of wore him out. He'd been writing, as I said, it's almost like a monastic calling where he's alone and devoted to writing in a way that I did not feel my personality.
So teaching keeps you plugged into the world?
I'm completely different from Philip. Philip had some disastrous relationships with women. He was married twice, I think, once to Claire Bloom and once to a woman who was a little...
Which those relationships infuse his writing, of course.
Yes, he writes very much about himself, yeah. He usually writes about himself in a droll way, that why did I make this mistake, How did I marry this woman and make this horrible mistake? There's a lot of
this woman who's gorgeous, intelligent, et cetera. Okay.
It was very self-deprecatory humor in Philip Roth. I guess you could call it a Jewish humor in Noise Complaint and so forth. But it's sort of a humor of incredulousness and outrage that he'd made so many mistakes. And Philip did teach, actually, at Princeton a long, long time ago. But he's not at all interested in teaching. I mean, basically, he would shudder at the thought of, quote, wasting time and squandering his emotion on other people. I'm not like... John Updike was the same way, and so was Kurt Vonnegut. They thought I was crazy to teach.
No, Kurt Vonnegut taught.
He taught...
He was a visiting professor when I was an undergrad.
I think he taught when he needed the money.
Could be.
Yeah. But these people didn't think that one should teach. There are a lot of people who are teaching who need the money, but I like to teach because it brings me into contact with very interesting and exciting young people, and I like going over classic texts with people, like reading some Hemingway, or reading some Eudora Welty, or Jack London, going over them with my students. I just have a different personality. I never felt that writing was as grim and as dutiful a task as Philip Roth felt it. I'm more likely to feel that there's a pleasure in it. And I do have writer friends who just think I'm insane. They say, "What? Pleasure in writing?" But I don't feel like these people. I feel more optimistic about the activity of writing.
So let's follow up on a remark you made about Philip Roth. So he stopped writing when he reached age 80, and he says that a tremendous burden has been lifted off his shoulders.
Yeah.
Do you have any intentions to stop writing? I mean, it looks like you're as prolific and as profound as ever.
I don't know. I don't understand why Philip has felt that way. A tremendous burden lifted off his shoulders. I don't know why he would feel that. I mean, I've had conversations with him. I just don't quite understand. I don't see why writing is a burden. I don't see why the pleasure of working with language and characters and settings, to me that's a pleasure. It would be like playing piano, if I could play piano, or painting, you know, if you could really paint well, or growing flowers, if you could really grow them well. There's pleasure in creativity, and I don't see why it's painful. Now, it can be painful sometimes, but the way Philip talked about it, as if it was always painful. So I just never understood that.
So a favorite quote of mine by Stephen King said, quote, "Amateurs sit and wait for inspiration. The rest of us just get up and go to work." You don't agree with that? It's not work for you.
Well, Stephen King, I don't think feels what he's doing is work either. There's an exhilaration and euphoria in translating semi-conscious images into conscious language. Stephen King, like H.P. Lovecraft and maybe Edgar Allan Poe, kind of in a little relationship there, they're very much tuned into the nightmare unconscious and finding narratives to put them in. So Stephen King has a tremendous successful career out of taking images from the unconscious, putting them into narratives and stories, and there's a lot of pleasure in doing it. He's also very funny. There's a lot of humor in Stephen King. He's not like Philip Roth, or he's not like, not like any writer who spends a lot of time picking words very carefully. There's a fluency and a conversational air.
So you're saying this about Stephen King like he's doing something that you don't understand about, but you've won 3 Bram Stoker Awards for your horror writing yourself.
No, I understand. I think.
Well, yeah, of course you do.
No, I understand Stephen King. It's people who think of writing as difficult and unpleasant. I don't understand them quite as well. You know, I don't really understand. Well, Flaubert spent so much time choosing just the right words. I'm more identified with someone like Charles Dickens, who had this fluency, and it was great exhilaration in describing London in the rain, for instance. You open a book by Charles Dickens, and you'll see just a vivid, lively, incredibly beautiful description of a city, like somebody walking in a city, and it's just so wonderful. You feel that the writer was really enjoying writing it. Whereas Philip Roth, evidently, for him it was a crabbed, difficult, parsimonious experience. So I'm not saying that there's anything superior in one way or the other, but I just don't see why one would be so painful.
Oh, so what's your system? What's a day like? How long do you write? Do you really write in longhand?
Oh, I do a lot of writing in longhand. When I came down here by car, I was scribbling, and I was in the back seat of a car and scribbling and working on my novel. So when I get back home, I'll just take my scribbles and put them in the computer or something like that. Well, I mentioned before that I care for my characters and I care for the people. Like the man without a shadow is no one whom I know, but as we get older, there are people around us who start to lose their memories. They start to lose their short-term memories. So how do you still love someone who is starting to forget even who he was himself? My novel is really a love story about a woman. Again, a woman finds a way. She finds a way to connect with a man whose short-term memory is only 70 seconds. 70 seconds is not very long. When I mentioned this back in Princeton, people said, well, almost everyone we know is in that category. They're not, not remembering.
Or maybe just the men.
People are telling the same stories over and over again. But in my novel, the person he's only 37, he's had encephalitis, and the brain swelled, and he didn't get help in time. And so the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain, which you say your daughter's studying neuroscience, she knows what the hippocampus is. It's a little seahorse-shaped part of the brain. I'm not sure where it is, but that's where memories...
Somewhere above the neck, yeah.
Yeah. Memories are processed. So if I tell you my name and where I live, you hear that, it goes into the hippocampus and it gets processed. It might go into your permanent memory and you might remember it. But it might not be retained because it doesn't seem that important. You're going to forget. If I give you a series of numbers, you're going to forget them. Very few people can remember a sequence of numbers. It doesn't seem important. But that's why when you go to a doctor, for instance, if the doctor is going to tell you something important, you should have somebody with you who's going to listen or take notes, because make no mistake, you're going to be anxious, you're not going to remember it. You'll remember something, but you might remember it wrong. Even though you're listening and watching the person's mouth as it goes into the short-term memory apparatus, it doesn't always necessarily work. So my novel is about a woman scientist who's working with this man who becomes a famous amnesiac. Because most extreme amnesiacs are suffering brain damage from alcohol or cancer or something. He's an unusual person in that his brain has been damaged in a very specific way, so science can study him in a way that it can't study these other people. Or people who are suffering from Alzheimer's where the brain is deteriorating. It's hard to experiment with those people. So my novel, as I said, is based on a real person, the very famous H.M. And my novel is also based on 2 or 3 other amnesiac patients. So everything in my novel, which my husband, who's a neuroscientist, read, everything in the novel that's scientific is supposedly accurate and real. And then the fictitious people are having these experiences. So how does one love someone who's losing his memory, and how is that bond of emotion established? That's what the novel is about. And I had great pleasure in writing it. I felt happy about it, even though it has a bittersweet ending. But it was an experience for me that I'd never had before.
So one last question from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. You've talked a little bit about Philip Roth, Stephen King, Ed Doctorow, but I've read where you've said that your role models were women who were childless, like Virginia Woolf, Jane Austen, George Eliot, and the Brontes. Is that a coincidence?
Did I say they were role models? I'm not sure that...
Well, I thought that's what you said, but you would certainly know better.
No, I don't think so. Certainly not Jane Austen. She's not a role model for me. No, not at all. I don't know what role...
Good, we've got some controversy going.
Well, a writer who's a writer's writer, whom many, many writers revere, and I certainly do, is James Joyce. Of course, he made life miserable for other people, and he was a terrible alcoholic. I would say that the persistence of James Joyce, the almost fanaticism and patience of James Joyce, as well as his genius, he would be a model of a kind for me, but not a personal model. Austen is a great writer, but her writing has virtually no influence on me. It's not the kind of writing that I'm interested in at all. George Eliot, much more, and some of her personal life. Virginia Woolf, maybe, but I'm not really a feminist who's looking only for female models. So, I mean, it's possible that I said something like that somewhere, but...
And it's possible, I mean, I tell lies for a living. It's possible I just made it up.
Well, the writers who have meant a lot to me certainly are James Joyce and William Faulkner and Kafka and Thomas Mann when I was younger. And so it's not because they're men or women or whatever. It's because of their writing rather than the gender.
So do we have any questions in the audience? It's hard to see from up here.
We can't see if we have an audience, actually.
Yes. Any questions?
Or something.
Raise your hand and a microphone will be heading towards you. And let's make sure that we're asking a question in 30 seconds that Ms. Oates can answer in a minute or two.
Hello, I'm Julia. I was wondering if you've ever As you've received awards and recognition, if you find yourself ever tempted to write for someone else, or like think about your fans and like alter your writing so you're thinking about pleasing them, and then does that, has your writing ever switched like that, where you suddenly, the way you're doing it is different, and then the outcome is maybe not what you are happy with in the end? I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, your question is very long and length, and my answer is so short. No. Sorry. Well, the question is, does the writer or does this writer alter his or her writing to project toward a certain audience or whatever? No, I couldn't even begin to think of how to do that. I think that people who are writing comedies, like situation comedies for television, whether it's like a committee of writers, they have to think of the audience, and they have to think of where there would be laugh lines, and they're aiming for laughs. But I wouldn't even know how to do that with my writing. I have to tell the story of these people who are together. As I said, I care for them a lot. I have to allow them to be fully realized. If there's something noble and admirable and exciting in this widow's life, I have to get her to the point where that happens. So I'm so concerned with getting her to that point that I can't have any thought of anything beyond the page, just the work of it. Waking up in the morning and think what these people are going to be doing in the next hour takes all my energy, actually.
Rather than repeating the questions, I'm hoping you'll speak right into the microphone so everyone can hear you. The next
right in the middle here. A question on teaching. You mentioned in the beginning of your conversation about a exercise that worked well for your students about monologues. What are some other exercises that have been fruitful for your students?
Oh, I have great exercises. I wish I'd brought a list of them. I really...
I teach, so that's helpful.
I love the way the students respond to these things. First of all, it's a sort of competition because they're all doing it, but it's not really competitive because they can all win. Well, I gave the example of writing a monologue from another point of view. I tell them, write a dialogue, 2 pages. And they say, well, about what? I say, that's up to you. And they say, oh, well, I don't think I can do it. Yes, you can do it. So a student may come back with this fantastically funny dialogue where it turns out it's like him talking to his mother on the telephone. His mother calls. And I have to say, my students are they love their mothers, but they are so funny with their mothers. There have been many telephone calls of a mother calling the student and just sort of transcribing the conversation. Really wonderful. So they read these to the class, and they get a lot of praise and attention from one another. Then another example, which is a little more serious, is to look back upon your life and remember something where you regret that you did something, and now you're going to give that regret to a fictitious person. And you're going to write a little letter of asking for forgiveness. But don't write it literally. Don't write literally about what you did or didn't do. Make it up. But what's going to be real is the situation. And they come up with brilliant things with that. And then another one, which is near the end of the semester when they've been writing for a while, is to write about a story about 12 pages long that turns out a moral or ethical decision, a clear-cut ethical decision. So they come up with wonderful, wonderful things. 2 years I've had Israeli students who had been in the Israeli army, and they're only like 19 or 20, but they're already more mature than the Princeton students who are both in their class. And they write these fantastic stories of being in the army, in the Israeli army, with the most remarkable details and dialogue and the sense of the smells and evoking that landscape. Those are really extraordinary bits of writing. Now, the other students who haven't had that experience are a little bit at a disadvantage because they don't have quite as much experience. But those are several examples where I just give them the idea and then they come back with fantastic content.
Thanks. Next.
Hi, Ruben. I wondered,
Can you speak really clearly and right into the mic, please?
Yes. I wondered if you had, even though you do not identify as a feminist writer or say that you don't pursue your role models necessarily on the basis of gender, I find your writing to be uniquely female. And I don't know why that is, but I don't think I could mistake, if I picked up one of your novels and read it, I don't think I could imagine it was written by a man. Does that sound sensible to you, and in what ways do you think being a woman contributes to your writing?
Well, that's perfectly true. I feel that way also. I feel that I have a certain identification, obviously, with women and girls. Like a 14-year-old girl, I just sort of feel that's the age that I am. We all have these ages. What's your age?
I think I'm in my early 30s.
Oh, really? Oh, wow, you're so mature. Well, no, I think when I was about 13 or 14 years old, it was my first introduction to taking a bus to a town and walking around and being alone and being kind of looking at things and sort of being almost autonomous or independent. So something was forged in me. And so a lot of my interest in writing sort of springs from that. And then the things that happen when you are a woman, you might be harassed in a way that most men probably wouldn't be. So you might be led to write about that. And then when you're a little older, to have children and fall in love and get married and lose your husband and be a widow, all those experiences are very, very female. They're not really uniquely female because men lose their wives and they're widowers, and that's the same sort of thing. They're not uniquely female, but I think I write about it from that perspective. But when I read about men, I was very, very close to my father. And so I kind of identify with a man also, with men who may be working class, who feel protective of their families. I sort of identify with that kind of man. So it's just part of my own background.
Do we have time for one or two more? Okay, go ahead.
Hi. Would you be open to describing your desk for us?
My desk?
Yeah, on a day where you kind of really feel the pleasure.
Okay, well, I'm happy to describe my desk, and I could send a picture. I've tweeted my desk in Princeton is just a normal-sized desk, and my computer, my laptop is like here. And usually right here, I have a manuscript and some things. But then on top of it is my kitty. My kitty, Cherie, is usually sleeping there. And we've subsequently gotten a Bengal kitten. So Cherie is sleeping maybe down in a chair, and the Bengal kitten is sleeping up there. And they sort of take turns. So that's my desk when I'm in Princeton. And I've tweeted that many times because the kitties are usually sound asleep, so my creativity doesn't impress them at all. I give them a manuscript to read, and they fall asleep immediately. But then I'm living in Berkeley right now for the term, and so my kitties are being watched over by my stepdaughter, my husband's daughter, and so they're being taken care of, and I'm very lonely for them. I don't have a desk. I think I'd be too lonely without the kitty. But I have like a sofa, end of a sofa, on a table with my manuscript on it and my laptop. So my desk right now is missing a kitty.
Couldn't you get some sort of kitty cam?
I should have a kitty cam. Well, people have sometimes asked me how I write so much, and I had to explain that when a kitty comes in your lap and settles in and starts to sleep and purr, and you might want to get up, you actually can't, because the kitty puts her claws in. No, this actually would happen to me with one of my cats. So I would write, the novel got longer and longer. It's just these Gothic novels getting longer because she would put her claws in and she would swish her tail irritably. And she said, you haven't written long enough today. So that's has a lot to do
Now
with
I see what my problem was.
You
I
don't
need
have a
some
cat.
cats, huh?
Do you have a dog?
No, I just
Well.
have kids.
Oh, well. The dog, I think, is not as good as a cat because the dog will wag his tail, and the dog likes everything you write. The dog is not critical. The dog is not critical. The cat is not really going to try to please you by being, effusive. So the cat, you have to work harder to please the cat. The dog just thumps his tail. It's just my opinion, sorry.
That's great.
Sorry.
One last question.
In terms of social justice in 2016, do you think it's possible for somebody to write some fiction that would penetrate the part of the electorate that seems to be raising up Trump or Cruz, for instance?
Well, in my writing, I usually take the side of the underdog. I'm sort of looking at America as a history of class warfare. And because I come from a working class background, I'm so sympathetic with people who are sort of at the periphery of power. And I've written a whole slew of novels from that point of view.
You don't see Donald Trump carrying them under his arm as he gets onto his plane?
Oh, I really don't want to talk about him. I tweet about him sometimes, but I don't spell his name out. It's T***P. Like really repulsive words you don't want to put out there. I think it's really unfortunate, and it's not him who's upsetting to us, it's his followers. I mean, he is just who he is, and he's been given such a mandate, and he's sort of, like Caligula. You get this person, you give Caligula or Nero, these are almost certifiable madmen who stand up in front of an audience and cut loose of their inhibitions and start relating to the demonic. Our European colleagues like Kafka and Thomas Mann wrote about these demonic urges Thomas Mann certainly wrote about that, and so did Kafka, like the rise of the Nazis, the sort of demonic urges that get cut loose by a certain kind of leader that wouldn't necessarily emerge with another leader. People are very impressionable, and people are looking for role models, and if it seems to them that civility and dignity and respect for education are the high values, people will adjust to that and sort of fall in line. If it seems to people that the demotic and the vulgar and cruel and bullying, that they become magnified and get applause, people start to follow that because people are impressionable. It isn't just teenagers, and children in middle school are very, very impressionable. That's why they need strong models within the family. They go this way, they can go that way, but a strong model will last for a lifetime within the family. But we have this pop culture where the images are sort of promiscuous and sort of almost uncontrollable. And I didn't grow up in a culture like that. I grew up in a much more of a print culture. And when I grew up, there was television, but there were only 3 channels. And they were all censored. And you saw very little that would really upset you.
So I'd like to just, as we're closing, recommend as an antidote to what's happening in the United States and the world, some of Ms. Oates' novels, essays, poetry. No, they're a good remedy.
Oh, thank you.
They're a good place to lose yourself and get some lessons. Thank you so much, Joyce. This was just terrific. We really appreciate you coming down and talking to us.